The darkness swallowed her whole on the third morning when the mineshaft floor gave way beneath her boots, and Sarah Zimmerman plummeted 15 feet into a forgotten tunnel that smelled of earth and decay and the death of dreams. She had been working the abandoned Silver Ridge mine outside Columbia, California since before dawn, searching for any overlooked veins of ore that might fund her passage back east. The year was 1876, and women did not typically venture into mining territory alone, but Sarah had learned long ago that survival required bending the rules society had written for her gender. Her father had taught her how to read rock formations before he died of lung fever 2 winters past, and she had been scraping by ever since, doing whatever work her hands could manage. The fall knocked the wind from her lungs and sent her oil lamp skittering into the shadows, where it flickered once and died. Pain radiated through her left ankle, sharp and persistent, and when she tried to stand, her leg buckled beneath her weight. She fell back against the damp stone wall, breathing hard, listening to the silence that pressed against her eardrums like water. Above her, the hole she had fallen through looked impossibly small, a ragged mouth of dim light that seemed to mock her predicament. The edges were unstable, loose rock and rotting timber supports that had finally surrendered to time and gravity. She tried calling for help, but her voice echoed uselessly in the confined space, bouncing back to her in hollow repetitions that sounded more like whispers than shouts. Sarah assessed her situation with the pragmatic mind her father had cultivated in her. She had fallen into what appeared to be an older section of the mine, probably dug in the early 50s during the first rush of prospectors who flooded California seeking fortune. The tunnel extended in both directions, disappearing into absolute darkness. Her ankle was either badly sprained or broken. She had no light source, no food, and only the half-full canteen she had been carrying on her hip. The first day passed in a haze of pain and failed attempts to climb out. Every time she tried to scale the wall, her injured ankle screamed in protest and the loose rock crumbled under her grip, raining down in streams that stung her eyes and filled her mouth with grit. She finally accepted that escape by her own means was impossible and settled into the corner that seemed most stable, rationing her water and trying not to think about how long a person could survive without food. Nobody knew she was here. She had been staying in a boarding house in Columbia, but she paid weekly and had 3 more days before anyone would wonder about her absence. She had told no one about her plans to explore Silver Ridge because claim jumping was still common enough that secrecy was survival. The bitter irony was not lost on her. By the second day, thirst became her constant companion. She allowed herself only the smallest sips from her canteen, letting the water sit on her tongue before swallowing, trying to make it last. Her stomach had stopped growling and settled into a dull ache that she tried to ignore. She spent the hours talking to herself, reciting poetry her mother had taught her, singing hymns in a voice that grew progressively weaker. Anything to keep the crushing silence at bay. She thought about her life, about the choices that had led her to this dark hole in the California earth. She had been 19 when her mother died of cholera, 20 when her father followed. At 22, she had few prospects and fewer options. Marriage had been suggested by well-meaning neighbors, but the men who showed interest wanted a docile wife to cook and clean and bear children, not a woman who could identify quartz formations and calculate the best angle for a support beam. So she had chosen independence, difficult as it was. She worked as a laundress, a seamstress, a cook in a mining camp where the men were too hungry to care that a woman prepared their meals. She saved every penny, dreaming of the day she might have enough to open a small business, perhaps a general store or a bakery. The mine had been a risk, a gamble that she might find enough overlooked ore to accelerate her timeline. Instead, it had become her tomb. On the third day, Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Her canteen was empty, the last drops long since savored and swallowed. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her tongue thick in her mouth. The darkness had become absolute, so complete that she could not tell if her eyes were open or closed. She drifted in and out of consciousness, dreaming of water, of sunlight, of her father's laugh. She tried to call for help one more time, but the sound that emerged was little more than a croak, a faint cry that she was certain could not carry beyond the confines of her prison. But she was wrong. Brennan Rhodes had been tracking a wounded elk for the better part of the morning, following the blood trail through the scrub brush and pine that dotted the foothills above Columbia. He was a cowboy by trade, working cattle drives between the valleys, but the drive would not resume for another week and his pockets needed filling. Fresh meat would fetch a good price in town, enough to pay his boarding and perhaps have a little left for a decent meal and a bath. The trail led him past the abandoned mines that pocked the hillside like old wounds. Silver Ridge had been one of the more prosperous operations back in its day, but the vein had played out years ago and the owners had moved on to richer prospects. Now, the mine was just another ghost in a landscape full of them, a reminder that fortune was as fickle as the wind. Brennan was about to give up on the elk, the blood trail having grown too faint to follow, when he heard it. A sound so soft he almost mistook it for the wind moving through the broken timbers that marked the mine entrance. But there it was again, a faint cry that raised the hair on the back of his neck. He was 26 years old, tall and lean from long days in the saddle, with dark hair that fell past his collar and eyes the color of coffee. He had seen enough of life to be cautious, but not so much that he had become callous. The sound was human, he was certain of that, and it was coming from somewhere inside the mine. Brennan approached carefully, mindful of the unstable ground. Mine collapses were common in the abandoned shafts, and he had no desire to join whoever was crying out. He called into the darkness, his voice strong and steady. "Hello? Anyone in there?" The response was immediate but weak, barely audible. Words he could not quite make out, but definitely human, definitely distressed. He returned to his horse and retrieved his rope and the oil lamp he kept in his saddlebag. The mare, a steady sorrel named Copper, waited patiently while he gathered what he needed. He lit the lamp and entered the mine, moving slowly, testing each step before committing his weight. The main tunnel was in poor condition, support beams sagging under the weight of the mountain, the floor littered with debris. He called out again, and this time he heard the response more clearly. "Help, please." A woman's voice, thin and desperate. Brennan followed the sound deeper into the mine, his lamp casting dancing shadows on the stone walls. He nearly missed the hole entirely, would have if he had not been moving so carefully. One moment there was solid floor, and the next there was nothing, a gaping cavity that disappeared into darkness. He knelt at the edge, holding the lamp out over the void. The light reached down 15 feet to where a woman lay crumpled against the far wall, her face turned up toward him, her eyes reflecting the lamplight like a wild animal. "I see you," he called down. "Are you hurt?" "My ankle," Sarah managed to say, her voice cracking. "I cannot climb." "How long have you been down there?" 3 days. 3 days without food, possibly without water. Brennan felt a surge of admiration for the woman's resilience. Many would not have survived. "I'm going to get you out," he said, his voice firm with promise. "My name is Brennan Rhodes. What is yours?" "Sarah Zimmerman." "Well, Miss Zimmerman, you just hold on a little longer. I will have you out shortly." He assessed the situation quickly. The hole was too deep for her to climb, even if she were uninjured, and the edges were too unstable to support a rope if she tried to haul herself up. He would need to widen the opening enough to create a stable anchor point, then go down and bring her up himself. Brennan returned to the surface and gathered more supplies from his saddlebag. He had a pickaxe that he carried for various purposes on the trail, a second rope, and a thick wool blanket. He also grabbed his canteen, which was nearly full. Back at the hole, he carefully lowered the canteen down on a rope. "Drink slowly," he instructed. "Not too much at once or you will be sick." He heard her sob as she reached for the canteen, a sound that was equal parts relief and desperation. He gave her a few minutes to drink, then pulled the canteen back up and began the work of stabilizing the hole. It took him over an hour to carefully chip away at the unstable rock and shore up the edges with pieces of timber he salvaged from other parts of the mine. The work was dangerous, each strike of the pickaxe potentially causing a larger collapse, but Brennan worked with the steady confidence of a man who had faced danger before and come through intact. Sarah watched from below, her strength slowly returning with the water in her system. She studied the man working so diligently above her, noting the careful precision of his movements, the way he tested each handhold before trusting it with his weight. He had kind eyes. She had seen that in the brief moment when the lamplight illuminated his face, and his voice carried a warmth that made her believe his promise to free her. Finally, Brennan had created a stable opening large enough for him to descend. He secured his rope around the sturdiest beam he could find, tested it with his full weight, then began to lower himself into the hole. The descent took only moments, and then he was standing beside her in the cramped tunnel, the lamp casting a warm glow that seemed almost bright after so long in absolute darkness. Up close, Sarah could see that he was younger than his confident demeanor suggested, perhaps mid-20s, with strong features and a jaw shadowed with several days' worth of beard. "Let me look at that ankle," he said, kneeling beside her. Sarah bit her lip as he gently probed the injured joint. His hands were surprisingly careful, the touch of someone accustomed to working with injured animals where too much force could cause more damage. "It is badly swollen," he said after a moment. "Could be broken, but I cannot tell for certain down here. Either way, you will not be walking on it. I am going to have to carry you up." "I can manage," Sarah said automatically, the independence that had sustained her for so long rising to the surface. "I am sure you can," Brennan said, and there was no mockery in his tone, only simple acknowledgement. "But there is no shame in accepting help when you need it. Save your strength for the climb. I will need you to hold on tight." He fashioned a makeshift harness from his rope, looping it around both of them so that Sarah was secured against his back. She wrapped her arms around his neck, her injured leg bent to avoid putting pressure on the ankle. She was acutely aware of his warmth, his strength, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes." The climb was slow and arduous. Brennan hauled them up hand over hand, his muscles straining with the effort of lifting both their weights. Sarah held on as tightly as she could, trying to stay still, not wanting to throw off his balance. She could feel the tension in his shoulders, hear the controlled breaths he took between pulls. Twice, loose rock gave way beneath his feet and he had to catch himself on the rope, swinging them both dangerously. Each time Sarah felt her heart lurch into her throat, but Brennan never faltered, never showed fear. He simply found new purchase and continued climbing. After what felt like an eternity, his hand reached the lip of the hole, and he hauled them both over the edge, collapsing onto the solid mine floor with Sarah still strapped to his back. They lay there for a moment, both breathing hard, and then Brennan carefully untied the rope and helped Sarah sit up. "Are you all right?" he asked. Sarah nodded, unable to speak around the lump in her throat. Now that she was safe, now that the terror of the past 3 days was finally releasing its grip, she found herself shaking uncontrollably. Tears streamed down her dirty face, cutting clean tracks through the grime. Brennan did not say anything foolish about not crying or being strong. He simply wrapped the wool blanket around her shoulders and let her weep, his presence steady and reassuring beside her. When the storm finally passed, Sarah wiped her eyes with the corner of the blanket and looked at the man who had saved her life. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate for the debt she owed him. "If you had not heard me, if you had not come—" "But I did," Brennan said simply, "and you are safe now. That is what matters." He helped her to her feet, supporting most of her weight as they made their slow way out of the mine. The sunlight, when they finally emerged, was so bright that Sarah had to close her eyes against it. She had never been so happy to feel the warmth on her face, the fresh air in her lungs. Copper waited patiently where Brennan had left her, cropping at the sparse grass. Brennan lifted Sarah onto the saddle as easily as if she weighed nothing, then swung up behind her. She leaned back against his chest, grateful for the support, as he turned the mare's head toward Columbia. The ride down the mountain took an hour. Brennan kept the pace easy, mindful of Sarah's injuries and exhaustion. He asked her careful questions about what had happened, and she told him about her search for ore, the collapse of the floor, the 3 days in the darkness. She found herself telling him more than she had intended, about her parents' deaths, her struggle to survive alone, her dreams of someday having a business of her own. Brennan listened without judgment, occasionally asking a question that showed he was truly paying attention. He told her a little about himself too, about growing up on a ranch in Texas, learning to rope and ride before he could properly read. His father had died when he was 15, killed by a horse that rolled on him during a storm. His mother had remarried a year later, and Brennan had left to make his own way, finding work on cattle drives that took him all over the West. "I like the movement," he said, "never staying in one place too long. But sometimes I wonder if I should not find a piece of land and settle down, build something permanent." "What stops you?" Sarah asked. Brennan was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I suppose I have not found a good enough reason to stop moving yet, he said finally. They rode into Columbia as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. The town was busy with the usual late afternoon activity, miners coming off their shifts, shopkeepers closing up for the day, women hurrying home to prepare supper. Several people turned to stare as Brennan rode down the main street with Sarah cradled in front of him, her clothes filthy and torn, her face still bearing the marks of her ordeal. Brennan took her directly to the doctor's office, a small building on the edge of town marked by a painted sign that swung in the breeze. Dr. William Harrison was an older man with steel gray hair and gentle hands. He took one look at Sarah and immediately began issuing orders, clearing his examination table and sending his assistant to fetch hot water and clean bandages. Brennan set Sarah carefully on the table and stepped back to give the doctor room to work. Dr. Harrison cut away Sarah's boot and stocking, his expression grave as he examined the swollen, discolored ankle. Teddy. It is not broken, he announced after a thorough examination, but it is a severe sprain. You will need to stay off it completely for at least 2 weeks, then another few weeks of limited activity after that. I will wrap it tight to support the healing, and you will need to keep it elevated as much as possible. He looked at Sarah with concern. You also show signs of significant dehydration and malnutrition. When was the last time you ate? 4 days ago, Sarah admitted. Breakfast, before I went to the mine. Dr. Harrison shook his head. You are lucky to be alive, young lady. A few more days and we would be having a very different conversation. He cleaned and bandaged her ankle, then gave her a thorough examination to check for other injuries. Aside from numerous cuts and bruises, she was in relatively good condition considering her ordeal. He prepared a draft to help with the pain and ordered her to drink it immediately. Where are you staying? He asked as he finished wrapping her ankle. Sarah gave him the name of the boarding house. Dr. Harrison frowned. Mrs. Patterson's place? Those stairs will be impossible for you to manage with your ankle in this condition. You need a ground floor room and someone to help you for the next few days at least. Sarah felt panic rising in her chest. She had no family, no close friends in Columbia. The thought of being dependent on strangers was almost as frightening as the darkness of the mineshaft had been. I will manage, she said, hearing the desperation in her own voice. I always do. She can stay at my boarding house, Brennan said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. He stood near the door, his hat in his hands, looking somewhat uncomfortable, but determined. I rent a room at the Davenport place on Main Street. Mrs. Davenport has a parlor on the ground floor that she sometimes lets as a bedroom when she has overflow guests. I am sure she would be willing to accommodate Miss Zimmerman, and I can help with whatever she needs until she is back on her feet. Dr. Harrison looked between them, his expression thoughtful. Are you family? He asked. No, Brennan admitted, but I found her in the mine. I suppose that makes me somewhat responsible for making sure she recovers properly. The doctor studied him for a long moment, then seemed to come to a decision. Very well, but mind you, Mr. Rhodes, there will be no impropriety. Miss Zimmerman is in a vulnerable state and deserves to be treated with utmost respect. Of course, Brennan said, looking slightly offended that the doctor would think otherwise. I was raised better than that. Doctor. Harrison nodded, satisfied. He turned to Sarah. Is this arrangement acceptable to you, Miss Zimmerman? Sarah looked at Brennan, this man who had already saved her life and was now offering to help her further. She barely knew him, but her instincts told her he was trustworthy. Besides, she had few other options. Pride was a luxury she could not currently afford. Yes, she said softly. Thank you, Mr. Rhodes. Brennan carried her out to his horse, and they rode the short distance to the Davenport boarding house. It was a large, well-maintained building with a wide front porch and cheerful yellow paint. Mrs. Davenport herself came out when she heard the horse, a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. Brennan explained the situation, and Mrs. Davenport immediately took charge, clucking over Sarah like a mother hen. The parlor was indeed available, and within an hour it had been transformed into a comfortable bedroom with a proper bed, clean linens, and a small table beside it for Sarah's personal items. Mrs. Davenport helped Sarah out of her filthy clothes and into a warm bath, washing the grime and blood from her skin with gentle efficiency. She provided a clean nightgown and insisted Sarah eat a bowl of beef broth before allowing her to rest. By the time Sarah was finally settled in the bed, propped up with pillows to keep her ankle elevated, exhaustion was pulling at her like a physical weight. "You rest now," Mrs. Davenport said, smoothing the blankets. "I will check on you in a few hours. If you need anything at all, you just ring this bell." She placed a small brass bell on the table beside the bed. "Thank you," Sarah whispered, her eyes already closing. She slept deeply, dreamlessly, for the first time in days. When she woke, it was morning, and sunlight was streaming through the parlor windows. Her ankle throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, but it was nothing compared to the agony she had endured in the mine. She felt clean, safe, and infinitely grateful to be alive. A soft knock at the door preceded Mrs. Davenport's entrance with a breakfast tray. "Good morning, dear. How are you feeling?" "Better," Sarah said honestly. "Much better." "Excellent. Mr. Rhodes asked me to let him know when you woke. He wanted to check on you if you were feeling up to visitors." Sarah felt a flutter of something in her chest at the mention of Brennan's name. "Yes, of course." Mrs. Davenport returned a few minutes later with Brennan following behind her. He had cleaned up since yesterday, his dark hair still damp from washing, wearing a fresh shirt and clean trousers. He looked younger in the morning light, and there was a hint of uncertainty in his expression as he approached the bed. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, stopping a respectful distance away, "I am glad to see you looking better." "Thanks to you," Sarah said. "I owe you my life, Mr. Rhodes." Brennan shifted uncomfortably, clearly unused to such direct gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "But anyone did not," Sarah said firmly. "You did, and I will not forget it." An awkward silence fell between them. Mrs. Davenport, sensing the tension, excused herself to fetch more hot water, leaving them alone. "How is your ankle?" Brennan asked, seizing on the safe topic. "Painful, but Dr. Harrison said it will heal." "That is good news." Another silence. Brennan cleared his throat. "I stopped by your boarding house this morning and collected your things. Mrs. Patterson was curious about where you had been, but I told her only that you had been injured and were recovering elsewhere. I hope that was all right." Sarah felt a surge of gratitude. "That was very thoughtful of you." "Your belongings are not much," he continued carefully, "which makes me wonder about your financial situation. Forgive me for being direct, but are you able to afford the doctor's fees and the cost of staying here? Because if not, I have some money saved and I would be happy to help until you are able to work again." Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and pride. "I have some money," she said quietly. "Not much, but enough to cover my immediate needs. I cannot accept charity, Mr. Rhodes." "It is not charity," Brennan said quickly. "It is one human being helping another. You would do the same if our positions were reversed, I think." Sarah looked at him, really looked at him, and seeing the sincerity in his coffee-colored eyes. "I would," she admitted, "but that does not make it easier to accept." "Then do not think of it as accepting," Brennan said, a smile lifting the corners of his mouth. "Think of it as allowing me to do what I know is right. It will ease my conscience considerably." Despite herself, Sarah felt her own lips curve in response. "When you put it that way, how can I refuse?" Over the following days, a routine developed. Brennan would stop by each morning before heading out to whatever work he had found for the day, checking to make sure Sarah had everything she needed. In the evenings, he would return and often sit with her for an hour or two, talking about inconsequential things that somehow felt important. Sarah learned that Brennan had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. He told stories about his cattle drive experiences with a self-deprecating charm, describing disasters and near misses with the comedic timing of a natural storyteller. In turn, Sarah found herself opening up about her own life, sharing memories of her parents, her struggles and small triumphs, her dreams for the future. Mrs. Davenport watched these evening visits with shrewd eyes, but said nothing, simply ensuring they were always properly chaperoned by keeping the parlor door open and making frequent trips past with various household tasks. After a week, Dr. Harrison pronounced Sarah's recovery to be progressing well. The swelling in her ankle had gone down considerably, and the bruising was fading from an alarming purple-black to a more manageable yellow-green. He gave her permission to begin putting weight on it, using a crutch for support, but warned her not to overdo it. The increased mobility was a blessing, Sarah was able to move around the boarding house, sitting in the main parlor with the other residents instead of being confined to her makeshift bedroom. She met the other boarders, a collection of miners, clerks, and traveling merchants who treated her with friendly courtesy. But it was Brennan's company she found herself anticipating most. He had a steadiness about him that she had rarely encountered in men. He listened when she spoke, truly listened, his attention never wandering to scan the room or interrupt with his own thoughts. He treated her as an equal, not as a delicate flower that needed protection or as a curiosity to be studied. One evening, about 10 days after her rescue, Brennan arrived at the boarding house later than usual. Sarah was sitting on the front porch, her injured ankle propped on a stool, watching the sun paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. She heard his boots on the wooden steps and turned to see him climbing toward her, a package wrapped in brown paper tucked under his arm. "I brought you something," he said, looking almost shy. Sarah took the package, surprised by its weight. She carefully unwrapped it to reveal a beautiful pair of leather boots, soft and supple, with sturdy soles and neat stitching. "You said your old boots were ruined when the doctor cut them off," Brennan explained, "and I thought, well, you will be needing a new pair once your ankle is healed. So I spoke to the cobbler and he made these. I hope they fit. I tried to remember how big your feet looked, but that's a strange thing to judge. So if they are wrong, we can take them back and—" "They are perfect," Sarah interrupted, her voice thick with emotion. She looked up at him, blinking back tears. "This is too much, Brennan. I cannot accept such an expensive gift." It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both noticed it. The air between them seemed to shift, becoming charged with something neither of them had acknowledged until this moment. "Please," Brennan said softly, sitting in the chair beside her. "Let me do this. You have been through so much, and you have been so strong through all of it. I just wanted to do something to help." Sarah looked down at the boots, running her fingers over the smooth leather. "Why are you being so kind to me?" she asked. "You barely know me." Brennan was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the sunset. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and honest. "When I heard you crying out in that mine, something inside me just knew that I had to help you. And then, when I saw you down there in the darkness, so brave despite being terrified, I felt something I've never felt before. Like I had been looking for something without knowing what it was, and suddenly there you were." He turned to look at her, his eyes intense. "These past weeks, getting to know you, hearing your stories, seeing your strength and determination, that feeling has only grown stronger. I find myself thinking about you constantly, worrying whether you are comfortable, whether you are healing properly, whether you might possibly feel even a fraction of what I am feeling." Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she was certain he must be able to hear it. "And what are you feeling?" she asked, barely breathing. "I think I am falling in love with you, Sarah Zimmerman," Brennan said simply. "Maybe I started falling the moment I heard your voice in the darkness. I know it is too soon, that we have not known each other long enough, that you might not feel the same way. But I have never been one to hide from the truth, and the truth is that you have become the most important person in my life." Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sadness. "I feel it too," she whispered. "I thought I was imagining it, that it was just gratitude for you saving my life. But it is more than that. When you walk into a room, everything becomes brighter. When you are gone, I count the hours until I see you again. I have never felt this way about anyone." Brennan reached out and took her hand, his thumb gently stroking across her knuckles. "Then we are in agreement," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "We are both falling." "What do we do now?" Sarah asked. "Now," Brennan said, lifting her hand to his lips and pressing a gentle kiss to her fingers, "we see where this takes us. No rushing, no pressure. Just two people getting to know each other and seeing if what we feel today is still there tomorrow and the day after that." Sarah nodded, unable to trust her voice. They sat together on the porch as the sun completed its descent and the first stars began to appear, their hands intertwined, the future suddenly full of possibilities neither of them had imagined just a few weeks before. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest Sarah could remember. Her ankle healed slowly but steadily, and as her mobility increased, so did the time she could spend with Brennan. He took her on gentle walks around Columbia, supporting her when her ankle grew tired, pointing out the various businesses, and introducing her to the shopkeepers and residents. She learned that Brennan was well-liked in town, known for his honest work and fair dealing. He had a reputation for helping people in need, whether it was fixing a widow's broken fence or helping a struggling merchant unload heavy goods. Sarah saw him in 100 different contexts and found herself falling deeper in love with each new facet she discovered. Brennan, for his part, seemed equally entranced. He sought out Sarah's opinions on everything from politics to literature to the best way to cook beans over a campfire. He brought her wildflowers he picked on his rides through the hills, their petals slightly crushed but somehow more beautiful for their imperfection. He read to her in the evenings from newspapers and dime novels, his voice bringing the words to life in a way that made her see the stories in vivid detail. Mrs. Davenport watched their courtship with approval, occasionally offering advice that Sarah found surprisingly helpful. The older woman had been married for 30 years before her husband passed, and she shared wisdom gleaned from decades of partnership. "The secret to a good marriage," she told Sarah one afternoon while they were shelling peas in the kitchen, "is choosing someone you actually like, not just someone you are attracted to. Attraction fades, or at least it changes. But if you genuinely enjoy spending time with the person, if you can talk to them about anything and laugh together at life's absurdities, then you have something that will last." Sarah thought about Brennan, about how much she genuinely enjoyed his company. "I do like him," she said softly. "More than I thought it was possible to like another person." Mrs. Davenport nodded sagely. "I can see that, and he clearly feels the same about you. Mark my words, that man is going to propose before summer is out." The prediction sent a thrill through Sarah, equal parts excitement and terror. Marriage had always seemed like a distant possibility, something other women did while she focused on simple survival. But with Brennan, it felt not just possible, but inevitable, as natural as breathing. Summer arrived in full force, bringing with it heat that shimmered off the dusty streets and turned the surrounding hills golden. Sarah's ankle had healed completely by then, and she had begun looking for work to replenish her dwindling funds. She found employment at the general store, helping with inventory and assisting customers. The pay was modest, but steady, and she felt the satisfaction of earning her own way once again. Brennan had been hired to help with a local ranch's cattle operation, working long days under the brutal sun. He would arrive at the boarding house each evening exhausted and dust-covered, but he always found the energy to spend time with Sarah, even if it was just sitting together on the porch in comfortable silence. One Sunday in late July, Brennan borrowed a buckboard from the livery and took Sarah on a picnic to a spot he had discovered in the hills above town. It was a small meadow beside a creek, shaded by ancient oak trees and carpeted with wildflowers that nodded in the gentle breeze. Sarah spread the blanket while Brennan unpacked the basket Mrs. Davenport had prepared for them. They ate fried chicken and biscuits, fresh strawberries and cheese, washing it down with cold lemonade that had been carefully packed with ice. After they ate, they lay side by side on the blanket, watching clouds drift across the impossibly blue sky. Brennan reached over and took Sarah's hand, lacing their fingers together. "I have been thinking," he said, not looking at her. "About what?" "About settling down, finding that piece of land I mentioned, building something permanent." Sarah's heart began to race. "Oh? There is a property about 5 miles from here," Brennan continued, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of nervousness. "It belonged to an old prospector who died last winter. His daughter back east is selling it for cheap because she just wants to be rid of it. It has a small house, a barn, and about 40 acres of good grazing land. I went to look at it last week." He finally turned to look at her, propping himself up on one elbow. "I have been saving for years, and I have almost enough to buy it outright. I could run cattle, maybe start a small breeding operation. It would be hard work, especially in the beginning, but it would be mine. Ours." Sarah sat up, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Ours?" Brennan sat up too, taking both her hands in his. "Sarah Zimmerman, I know we have only known each other a few months. By all reasonable standards, this is far too soon. But I have never been more certain of anything in my life. I love you. I love your strength, your intelligence, your kindness, your stubbornness. I love the way you laugh at my terrible jokes and the way you challenge me when you think I am wrong. I love everything about you, and I want to spend the rest of my life proving it." He took a deep breath. "I do not have a ring yet, and this is probably not the romantic proposal you deserve, but I cannot wait another moment. Will you marry me? Will you build a life with me on that land? Will you take a chance on a wandering cowboy who has finally found a reason to stop moving?" Sarah felt tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling so broadly her cheeks ached. "Yes," she said, laughing through the tears. "Yes, of course I will marry you. Brennan Rhodes, I would be honored to spend my life with you." Brennan let out a whoop of joy and pulled her into his arms, spinning her around until they both collapsed back onto the blanket, laughing and kissing and planning their future under the warm California sun. They were married 6 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Columbia. Sarah wore a dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Davenport had helped her sew, with wildflowers woven into her hair. Brennan wore his best suit, his dark hair slicked back, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as she walked down the aisle toward him. Mrs. Davenport served as Sarah's matron of honor, weeping openly throughout the ceremony. Several of Brennan's friends from the ranch stood up with him, grinning as the preacher pronounced them man and wife. The wedding breakfast was held in Mrs. Davenport's dining room, a feast of epic proportions that the landlady had been preparing for days. There was ham and turkey, fresh bread and preserves, pies and cakes and cookies. The other boarders attended, as did many of the townspeople who had come to know and like the young couple. Dr. Harrison raised a toast to Sarah's remarkable recovery and Brennan's heroic rescue. "To think that such a terrible ordeal could lead to such happiness," he said, his eyes twinkling. "It just goes to show that we never know what the Lord has planned for us." As the party wound down and the summer evening stretched long shadows across the town, Brennan and Sarah climbed into the buckboard, now loaded with their belongings and wedding gifts. They drove through the twilight to their new property, their new home. The house was small but sturdy, built of timber and stone with a wide front porch and a chimney that promised warmth in the winter months. The barn was in need of some repair, but it was structurally sound. The land stretched out around them, rolling hills dotted with oak trees and good grass for grazing. Brennan carried Sarah over the threshold, both of them laughing at the tradition. He set her down gently in the main room, which served as kitchen, dining area, and parlor, all in one. The previous owner's furniture remained, sturdy pieces that would serve them well. "It is not much," Brennan said, looking around with a critical eye, "but we can make it into a real home." "It is perfect," Sarah said, meaning it. She had spent so many years without a true home, moving from one temporary lodging to another. This place, modest as it was, represented stability, safety, and a future with the man she loved. "It is absolutely perfect." Their first year of marriage was filled with hard work and harder lessons. Neither of them had managed a ranch before, and they made plenty of mistakes along the way. The cattle they purchased with their combined savings proved to be more temperamental than expected. The garden Sarah planted withered in an unexpected dry spell. The barn roof leaked during the first rain and required expensive repairs. But through it all, they faced each challenge together, learning and adapting and growing stronger as a couple. Brennan proved to be a patient teacher, showing Sarah the skills he had learned on cattle drives. Sarah brought her own talents to bear, keeping meticulous records of their finances and making shrewd decisions about when to sell and when to hold. They worked side by side from dawn to dusk, falling into bed exhausted each night but content. On Sundays, they would rest, attending church in Columbia, and then spending the afternoon simply enjoying each other's company, reading or walking the property or making plans for improvements. In the spring of their second year, Sarah discovered she was pregnant. The news filled them both with joy and terror in equal measure. They had talked about children, of course, dreaming about the family they would build, but the reality was far more immediate and frightening than the fantasy had been. Brennan became almost comically overprotective, insisting Sarah rest constantly and refusing to let her help with any of the heavier ranch work. Sarah tolerated his fussing with amused patience, knowing it came from love, but she also insisted on maintaining her share of the responsibilities. She was pregnant, not an invalid. Mrs. Davenport came to stay with them for the last month of Sarah's pregnancy, helping with the household tasks and providing the experienced presence they both needed. When Sarah's labor began on a warm October afternoon, it was Mrs. Davenport who sent Brennan to fetch Dr. Harrison while she prepared the bedroom and talked Sarah through the contractions. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next morning. Brennan paced the main room, wearing a track in the floorboards, jumping at every sound from the bedroom. Finally, as the sun was cresting the eastern hills, he heard the thin, reedy cry of a newborn baby. Mrs. Davenport emerged a few minutes later, her face tired but wreathed in smiles. "You have a son," she announced, "a healthy, strong boy with a good set of lungs on him." Brennan rushed into the bedroom, finding Sarah propped against the pillows, exhausted but glowing, a tiny bundle cradled in her arms. Dr. Harrison was packing up his bag, looking satisfied. "Come meet your son," Sarah said softly, her eyes shining with tears. Brennan approached slowly, almost afraid, and looked down at the red-faced, squalling infant, his son, his and Sarah's son. The reality of it hit him like a physical blow, and he sank onto the edge of the bed, reaching out with one finger to touch the baby's impossibly small hand. The infant's fingers closed around Brennan's finger with surprising strength, and the crying stopped. Dark eyes, still unfocused, seemed to look up at him, and Brennan felt something in his chest crack open, a well of love so deep he had not known it existed. "He is perfect," Brennan whispered. "He is absolutely perfect." They named him Benjamin, after Brennan's father, with the middle name of Samuel, after Sarah's father. Benjamin Rhodes grew quickly, a happy baby who rarely cried and seemed fascinated by everything around him. Sarah took to motherhood with the same determined competence she brought to everything, learning as she went and somehow always knowing what Benjamin needed. Brennan was a devoted father, spending every spare moment with his son. He would carry Benjamin around the ranch, narrating everything they saw. "That's a cow, son. See how she chews? That's called a cud. And over there, those are our chickens. They give us eggs for breakfast." The ranch continued to grow and prosper. Word spread about the quality of the cattle Brennan raised, and buyers began coming from as far away as Sacramento. Sarah expanded her garden and began selling produce in town, adding to their income. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were comfortable, building a life of substance and meaning. Benjamin was joined by a daughter when he was 3 years old. They named her Grace, and she proved to be as different from her brother as night from day. Where Benjamin was calm and observant, Grace was energetic and vocal, demanding attention and getting it through sheer force of personality. Brennan adored her, this tiny whirlwind who had him wrapped around her finger from the moment she was born. 2 years after Grace, another son arrived, whom they named Thomas. And 3 years after Thomas came another daughter, Elizabeth, who would prove to be their last child. The house that had seemed so spacious when it was just the two of them now bulged with children and noise and laughter. They added on 2 bedrooms and a proper dining room, Brennan doing most of the construction work himself with help from neighbors. The children grew up knowing the value of hard work. As soon as they were old enough, they were given chores appropriate to their age, collecting eggs, feeding chickens, helping in the garden. But there was also time for play, for fishing in the creek that bordered their property, for riding the gentle horses Brennan kept for the children, for lazy summer afternoons reading under the oak trees. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Brennan surprised Sarah with a gift that made her weep. It was a sign, beautifully carved and painted, that read, "Zimmerman Rhodes Ranch," in flowing script. "I wanted to honor both our names," Brennan explained as they stood together looking at the sign he had just mounted above the ranch entrance. "This place exists because of both of us, because of the strength and love we have built together. It should reflect that." Sarah leaned against him, his arm coming around her shoulders in the familiar gesture that still made her heart flutter even after a decade. "Thank you," she said, "for this, for everything, for pulling me out of that mine shaft and into the life I never knew I could have." "Thank you for letting me," Brennan said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "For taking a chance on a wandering cowboy and making him the happiest man alive." The years continued to roll past, marked by the changing seasons and the milestones of their children's lives. Benjamin grew into a serious young man who had inherited his father's way with animals and his mother's head for business. Grace was all fire and spirit, constantly challenging expectations and dreaming of adventures beyond the ranch. Thomas was the peacemaker, the one who could smooth over any family disagreement with his gentle humor. And Elizabeth, the baby, was content to spend hours in the garden with Sarah, learning about plants and growing things. When Sarah turned 40, she stood on the porch of their home one evening, watching the sunset over the land she and Brennan had built together. The children were inside, the older ones helping the younger with their lessons. Brennan was in the barn, finishing the evening chores. She thought back to that terrified young woman trapped in the mine shaft, certain she was going to die alone in the darkness. If someone had told her then that she would end up here, with this life, this family, she never would have believed it. The journey from that dark hole to this moment of perfect contentment seemed impossible, a story too fantastical to be true. But it was true. It was her life, built moment by moment, choice by choice, always with Brennan beside her. She heard his footsteps on the porch and turned to see him approaching, still moving with the easy grace that had attracted her from the beginning, though his dark hair was now shot through with silver and lines creased his face around his eyes and mouth. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "About how lucky I am," Sarah said simply. "About how grateful I am that you heard me crying out that day." Brennan smiled, the expression lighting up his face the way it always had. "I am the lucky one," he said. "I was just wandering through life, and then I found you. You gave me a reason to stop wandering, to put down roots, to build something that matters." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. "I love you, Sarah Rhodes. I have loved you since the moment I saw you in that darkness, and I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that too." "I love you too," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion, "always and forever." They stood together as the sun completed its descent and the first stars began to appear, the same stars that had witnessed their first declaration of love on a porch in Columbia so many years ago. The sounds of their children drifted out through the open windows, laughter and conversation, and the ordinary chaos of family life. This, Sarah thought, was what she'd been searching for all those years ago when she ventured into that mine. Not silver or gold, but something infinitely more valuable, a home, a family, a love that had pulled her from darkness into light and sustained her through everything that followed. The years continued their march, bringing with them the joys and sorrows that mark any life well lived. Sarah's hair turned silver, and Brennan's back grew stiff from decades of hard work. But they remained as devoted to each other as they had been in those early days of courtship, always finding reasons to smile at each other across a crowded room, always seeking each other's counsel on important decisions, always coming together at the end of each day to share what they had experienced. Benjamin married at 22, bringing home a spirited young woman named Anna, who fit seamlessly into the family. They built a house on the far corner of the ranch property and began raising cattle of their own, expanding the operation. Their first child, a son they named Brennan after his grandfather, arrived the following year, making Sarah and Brennan grandparents for the first time. Grace, true to her nature, did not settle down as quickly. She spent several years traveling, working as a school teacher in various mining camps in small towns throughout California and Nevada. She sent letters regularly, filling pages with descriptions of the people she met and the places she saw. When she finally did marry at 30, it was to a newspaper editor in San Francisco, and they built a life far different from the ranch, but no less fulfilling. Thomas took over more and more of the daily ranch operations as Brennan's strength began to wane, showing the same patient competence his father had displayed. He married at 25 and brought his wife Margaret to live in the main house, which had become large enough to comfortably accommodate multiple generations. Elizabeth, the youngest, proved to have a talent for healing. She apprenticed with Dr. Harrison until his retirement, then took over much of his practice, becoming one of the few female doctors in the region. She never married, declaring that her work was fulfilling enough, though Sarah suspected there had been a young man once who had broken her daughter's heart. When Brennan turned 65, the family threw a grand celebration at the ranch. It seemed like half of Columbia turned out, along with ranchers and cowboys and business people from throughout the region. Everyone had a story to share about Brennan, about his fairness and his kindness, about the time he had helped them when they needed it. Sarah watched her husband holding court on the front porch, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends, and her heart swelled with pride and love. This man, who had heard her faint cries in the darkness all those years ago and refused to leave her there, had built a legacy that extended far beyond their ranch. He had touched countless lives with his quiet goodness, and the ripples of that goodness would continue long after he was gone. That evening, after all the guests had departed and the grandchildren had been put to bed, Sarah and Brennan sat together in their bedroom, exhausted but happy. Brennan was moving more slowly these days, his joints stiff with arthritis, but his eyes still sparkled when he looked at Sarah. "That was quite a party," he said, easing himself into the chair beside the window. "You deserve it," Sarah said, coming to stand behind him and resting her hands on his shoulders. "You have built an amazing life, Brennan. You should be proud." "We built it," Brennan corrected, reaching up to cover one of her hands with his. "Everything good in my life started the day I heard you calling from that mine shaft. You are the foundation everything else is built on." Sarah bent and pressed a kiss to the top of his head, breathing in the familiar scent of him, soap and leather and sun-warmed skin. "We saved each other," she said softly. "I was trapped in the darkness, and you pulled me into the light. But you were lost too, wandering without purpose, and I gave you a reason to stop and build something permanent. We needed each other." "We did," Brennan agreed. "And we still do." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, content in the knowledge that whatever time they had left, they would face it together. Sarah was 72 when Brennan died. He went peacefully in his sleep on a cool autumn morning, his hand still holding hers. Dr. Elizabeth confirmed what Sarah already knew, that his heart had simply worn out after 75 years of steady beating. The funeral was attended by over 200 people, testament to the life he had lived and the people he had touched. Sarah stood dry-eyed through the service, holding tight to Benjamin's arm, accepting condolences with quiet dignity. She had known this day would come eventually, had tried to prepare herself for it, but nothing could have truly readied her for the hollow ache of losing the man who had been her partner for over 40 years. In the weeks that followed, Sarah struggled to find her footing. The ranch continued operating under Benjamin and Thomas's capable management, but Sarah felt adrift, purposeless. She had defined herself for so long as Brennan's wife, as part of a partnership, that she did not know how to exist alone. Elizabeth moved back to the ranch to stay with her mother, worried about her increasing withdrawal. But it was Benjamin who finally broke through Sarah's grief with a simple observation. "He would not want you to stop living," Benjamin said one morning, finding his mother sitting on the porch staring at nothing. "Father spent his entire life fighting to make sure you were safe and happy. Do not dishonor that by giving up now." The words struck Sarah like a physical blow, knocking loose something that had been frozen inside her. Benjamin was right. Brennan had fought for her happiness from the moment he pulled her from that mine shaft. The best way to honor his memory was to continue living the life they had built together, to find joy where she could, to remain engaged with the family and community they had created. Sarah began to heal, slowly but steadily. She threw herself into helping with the grandchildren, sharing stories about their grandfather that kept his memory alive. She worked in her garden, finding peace in the rhythm of planting and weeding and harvesting. She visited friends in Colombia, attended church socials, participated in the life of the community. 3 years after Brennan's death, Sarah was blessed with her first great-grandchild, Benjamin's grandson. Holding the tiny infant in her arms, Sarah felt the circle of life continuing, felt the love that she and Brennan had built rippling forward into future generations. She lived another 12 years, remaining sharp and engaged until the very end. She was 84 when she died on a warm spring morning, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, slipping away as gently as a sigh. They buried her next to Brennan on a hill overlooking the ranch, under the oak tree where they used to sit together in the evenings. The stone they placed to mark the graves was simple but elegant, bearing both their names and the dates of their lives, along with an inscription that Elizabeth had chosen. Two souls who found each other in the darkness and built a life in the light. The Zimmerman Rhodes Ranch continued to thrive under the management of subsequent generations, each adding their own innovations while honoring the foundation that Sarah and Brennan had laid. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold to children and grandchildren, a reminder that sometimes the darkest moments can lead to the brightest futures. In Columbia, California, there is still a marker near the old Silver Ridge mine, placed there by the family decades after the rescue. It reads simply, "On this site in 1876, Brennan Rhodes saved Sarah Zimmerman from certain death. Their love story began in darkness but bloomed in the light, a testament to courage, compassion, and the enduring power of the human heart." The mine itself has long since been sealed for safety, the entrance covered over and marked with warnings. But sometimes, when the wind moves through the old timbers and whispers across the hillside, it sounds almost like voices, like a woman's faint cry and a man's answering call echoing across the years, a reminder that true love can transcend even the darkest depths and build something lasting and beautiful that continues long after the original builders have passed on. The legacy of Sarah and Brennan Rhodes lives on not just in the family that bears their name or the ranch that still operates under their banner, but in the values they embodied and passed down through generations: hard work and perseverance, kindness and compassion. The understanding that sometimes the greatest treasures in life are not the ones we dig from the earth, but the ones we find in each other. That when we hear someone calling from the darkness, we have a responsibility to answer, to reach down and pull them toward the light. Because in saving others, we often save ourselves, finding purpose and meaning and love in places we never expected to look. Their story, born in the depths of an abandoned mine shaft on a spring morning in 1876, became a foundation upon which an entire legacy was built, proof that even the most desperate circumstances can transform into something beautiful when two people choose to face the future together, hand in hand, heart to heart, from that first moment of rescue until their final breath and beyond, into memory and legend.